Welcome to the deep dive. So, if you've ever looked through history and thought, it feels like every great civilization falls for the exact same reasons, invasions, famine, plagues, then this is the deep dive for you. We're going to take a hammer to that superficial list.
We really are. I mean, those things you mentioned, war, famine, our sources argue they're just symptoms. They're what collapse looks like on the surface.
But not the cause.
Not the deep structural cause, no.
Exactly. So our mission today is to get into the structural mechanics of it all, to move past the easy answers and look at the internal engine that seems to guarantee collapse. What is the architecture of failure?
And what the source material points to, again and again, is that collapse doesn't really come from the outside. It starts from within, from this irreversible process called the centralization loop.
The centralization loop. And the logic of this loop, when you really trace it, it's arresting. It suggests that centralization takes abundance and turns it into hierarchy. Then it takes that hierarchy and turns it into fragility.
And that fragility, eventually, into a kind of terminal delusion.
Right. So the core question for us today is, why do all large-scale human systems, from ancient Sumer to, well, right now, seem to be locked into this exact pattern?
Well, it has to start somewhere. And it always starts with what our sources call a resource hub.
A resource hub.
Yeah, think about it. A civilization sparks to life around a critical resource. Maybe it's a fertile river valley like the Nile, or a strategic port for trade. This hub generates a surplus. More food, more goods than people immediately need.
Okay, so you have a surplus. That sounds like a good thing. Why does that immediately create a hierarchy?
Because that surplus has to be guarded. It has to be measured and it has to be distributed. And the people who step up to do that guarding and measuring, the priests, the warriors, the early bureaucrats, they naturally form an administrative class.
They become the managers.
They become the managers. And that act of managing the resource is the birth of the hierarchy. That's the engine of centralization right there.
That makes perfect sense. So surplus requires management. Management creates hierarchy.
Yeah.
And once you have this centralized structure, the next step is complexity. Bureaucracy, laws, taxes. We usually see that as progress. But what's the hidden cost?
The hidden cost is fragility. That's the trade-off. Think of a tiny, decentralized village. It's resilient. If one family's crop fails, the village as a whole survives.
Mm-hmm.
Now scale that up to a massive empire. As you centralize, you add more and more nodes, more connections, and everything becomes interdependent. More complexity means more points of failure.
So you're saying this isn't about history or culture, it's a structural law. It applies to Rome just as much as it does to, say, the global financial system.
Absolutely. It's a law of systems, not of history. And what's important here is that it removes the moral blame. It's not that people got lazy or corrupt. It's that the system itself reached a structural breaking point because of its own complexity.
This feels a bit abstract, but when we bring in the idea of supply chains, it becomes, well, terrifyingly real.
This is the critical shift. A single community lives by the rule, we eat what our land gives us. Their risk is local. But a centralized civilization operates on a new rule. We eat only if 10,000 strangers, hundreds of miles away, all do their jobs perfectly.
From the farmer to the sailor to the guard at the warehouse.
Exactly. You've just transformed decentralized risk into centralized network-wide risk. A single broken link, a pirate raid, a collapsed bridge can starve a city.
Which brings us to a really crucial mathematical point from the sources. Complex systems don't just fail, they decay exponentially.
Yes, they fail faster than they grow. That's why collapse always seems so sudden to the people living through it. Things feel fine one day, and then seemingly overnight, the entire structure is gone.
Okay, lay that out for us, because exponential decay can sound a bit academic. What does that actually feel like?
Well, think about an old computer. It works fine for years. You keep adding software, files, updates. It gets a tiny bit slower, but you don't really notice. Then one day, you install one more thing, and it doesn't just slow down a little, it crashes. It's totally unusable. Okay. That feeling of sudden, total failure, even though the problems were invisibly building up for months, that's exponential decay. And that is how civilizations break.
That's a great analogy. So if that's what's happening to the structure, what's happening to the people inside it, this is where the concept of zoo dynamics comes in, which is just fascinating.
It is. A zoo isn't defined by its walls. It's defined by dependence. The system provides everything: food, security, a predictable structure.
And when you outsource your own survival, what happens?
The population starts to lose the very traits that made their ancestors successful: self-sufficiency, awareness of their environment, physical toughness. And maybe most importantly, a realistic perception of threats. They're no longer selected for adaptability, but for compliance.
So you're saying the comfort and security of civilization actually makes the population biologically and psychologically weaker, less fit to survive a real crisis.
The sources argue that structurally, yes, the evidence is there in the skeletal remains. People become less robust. You see signs of increased psychological fragility, a lower reproductive drive, and what the sources call delusional cognition. The mind can't reconcile the daily comfort with a system's underlying decay.
Let's connect that to the social structure. Centralization also supercharges something called reproductive skew. How does hierarchy warp the gene pool?
It's a stark biological rule. Resource control equals mating control. In a centralized system, a tiny elite, the rulers, the top merchants, control a vast majority of the resources. And therefore, they have a vastly disproportionate amount of reproductive opportunity.
It creates a reproductive pyramid.
A very steep one, yes. A few men at the very top have immense reproductive success, while a huge number of men at the bottom have little to none. This causes a massive bottleneck, a concentration of lineages, and a collapse in overall genetic diversity.
And we can actually see this in the data. You mentioned Neolithic male bottlenecks. What does that look like?
If you look at ancient DNA, especially the Y chromosome, you can see these periods where male genetic diversity just plummets. It's just a tiny fraction of men were successfully reproducing. You see the same pattern in, say, Bronze Age elite burials where incredible wealth and genetic dominance go hand in hand. Collapse, ironically, flattens that pyramid and restores diversity.
So as this fragility builds, we enter what's called the terminal delusion phase. What does that look like? What defines this stage right before the break?
It's a state of profound cognitive dissonance. The infrastructure is literally crumbling, supply chains are breaking, but the official belief in the system's permanence is at its peak.
What are the markers of that?
Two big ones. First, narrative inflation. Because the material reality is decaying, the stories the society tells itself, the religious myths, the political propaganda, have to get bigger and grander to cover the cracks.
Like building giant monuments while the aqueducts are leaking.
Precisely. The second is elite detachment. The people in charge are living in an insulated bubble, completely disconnected from the reality on the ground for everyone else.
And the general population just doesn't see the cliff they're walking towards.
That's collapse blindness. We talked about exponential decay. The human mind is great at seeing linear change things getting a little worse each year, but we are terrible at perceiving exponential risk. The stress builds invisibly, so the final break feels impossible right up until the moment it happens.
And that final break is often triggered by just one thing failing.
Exactly, because it's also interdependent. The final cascade can be started by any one of the core systems failing. The food supply, the fuel network, the electrical grid, water purification. In a brittle system, any single shock can bring the whole thing down.
So if the slow decay, that invisible phase one, takes centuries, why does the actual fall, the visible break, seem to happen so fast? In just a few decades or even years?
Because the failure is nonlinear. During those centuries of decline, the system is accumulating invisible stress. We can call it load accumulation. Stress on the infrastructure, stress on social trust, stress on the environment.
So the system looks fine on the outside, but it's internally strained to its absolute limit.
Exactly. It's like a bridge with hidden cracks. It holds traffic for years until one final truck, the one that's just a single pound too heavy, drives onto it. That's the threshold effect. That final stress and invasion, a drought, doesn't just damage the system, it shatters it because it was already at 99.9% of its breaking point.
And then one failure triggers another.
A cascading interaction. The power grid fails, so the water pumps stop. Without clean water, disease spreads. The healthcare system collapses, which leads to civil unrest. Complexity becomes a vulnerability, not a strength.
Okay, so just to be clear for everyone listening, there are two distinct phases.
Phase one, the slow decline. Invisible. Centuries of losing resilience while daily life seems to continue. And phase two, the visible break. Explosive, catastrophic, and often blamed on whatever the final trigger was.
Which brings up a key point. If this mechanism is universal, the archaeological evidence should be universal too. What are the forensic markers you find at collapse sites everywhere, from the Maya to Mesopotamia?
The markers are eerily consistent. You always find infrastructure decay outpacing repair. They're building new temples but not fixing the roads. You see administrative bloat, more and more bureaucrats and tax collectors, fewer and fewer people actually producing things.
A top-heavy society.
A very top-heavy society. And you see it in the bones. Declining nutrition, physical stunting. At the same time, you see exploding inequality in the burials. Lavish, elite tombs, right next to simple pits for commoners.
And you mentioned a cognitive marker too, ritual intensification.
A huge one. When the real world is failing, society doubles down on the symbolic one. More religion, more complex rituals. It's a psychological coping mechanism. And then the final marker, the sudden mass abandonment of cities.
But you also said that archaeologists often get the story wrong.
Well, yeah, they're working with what's left, which leads to two major biases. First is survivorship bias. We only see the stone and pottery. All the complex organic stuff, the knowledge, the social systems is gone. Second is the final version illusion. We judge a civilization's peak by the ruins of its end stage. It's like judging our entire era by a single, abandoned, rusted-out factory.
Okay, so we've laid out the mechanism of collapse. Now for the aftermath. The reset. The reversion fractal. How does humanity crawl back from something so total?
This is key. It doesn't dissolve into random chaos. The system reliably fractures along a predictable line. It splits into two distinct survival pathways, a bifurcation.
These are the two types of survivors?
We call them Tyche A, the above-ground Reverters. These are the highly adaptive, resilient groups. They shed complexity almost immediately. They're self-sufficient. They move out, away from the dead cities, into the forests and plains, and become the new baseline population.
They basically undomesticate themselves.
They do. And then there's the other path, Type B, the subterranean Descendants. These are the fragile, hierarchy-dependent groups who cling to the old ways. They can't adapt, so they insulate. They retreat inward to fortified monasteries, hidden valleys, maybe even underground shelters, and they preserve the symbols and knowledge of the old system even if they can no longer enact it.
It's incredible how that split Reverters moving out, Descendants moving in, seems to be the source of our oldest myths.
It's the most compelling part of this whole model. This is almost certainly the origin of the global myth of the two peoples, of underground cities, of ancient elves, dwarves, or demons. These are likely the distorted, mythologized memories of these two very different human groups meeting again after centuries apart.
And the final stage of the cycle is when they meet again, reintegration.
Yes. The two branches fuse. The Reverters bring their practical skills, their ecological knowledge, their robust genetic diversity. The Descendants bring the memory of institutional order, the preserved texts, the symbolic glue. That fusion creates the spark for the next golden age. Every Renaissance is born from it.
So to summarize this whole deep dive, what we're really saying is that collapse isn't some kind of moral failure. It's a predictable law of systems, hardwired into the act of concentrating resources and building hierarchies.
And that gives us a kind of governing equation for the whole cycle. Evolution is linear, civilization is cyclical, emergence is fractal. The pattern repeats, but with new variations each time. That's why the collapses look so similar, and the myths resonate globally.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to take away. If you follow this logic all the way through, the definition of civilization becomes fundamentally tied to the definition of collapse. Civilization is not the opposite of collapse. It is the engine that produces collapse.
And so the final question for you, the listener, is this. If our current global system is the terminal state of this long agricultural cycle, and every civilization has to shed its old exoskeleton to survive, which branch of the reversion fractal do you currently occupy?